Welcome to the Global Voices interview series. I'm Lana Wong and we're coming to you live from the World Bank IMF spring meetings here in Washington, D.C. Today we're honored to have Mark Lowcock, the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and the Emergency Relief Coordinator for UN OCHA, which is the UN Office for Coordination for Humanitarian Affairs. Mark has had a long career leading and managing the humanitarian crises response in some of the most challenging environments all around the world. And today we'll be discussing how humanitarian and development agencies work together to support these most vulnerable populations. Before I start, I'd also like to welcome our online audience and encourage you to please submit your thoughts and questions in the comments section of the video. So Mark, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's great to be with you.
Thank you. To get started, can you explain to our audience what the role of international financial institutions like the World Bank have in humanitarian crises?
So a lot of the crises we're dealing with have an economic dimension to them, and obviously the World Bank and the IMF are at the heart of international economic policy making. So for example, the world's biggest humanitarian crisis right now is in Yemen. A conflict, and also a very difficult economic situation with the exchange rate under tremendous pressure, lots of difficulty in managing trade flows. Yemen's a country for which for a long time has imported more than 90% of its food, and so the role that the IMF and the World Bank have played in that crisis has been very important. The IMF in providing advice to everyone on how to try and keep the macroeconomic situation stable, and the World Bank as a provider of resources, including to UN agencies, to keep public works going, to get salaries paid to ordinary public servants who haven't been paid in many cases for a long time. So lots of ways in which the international financial institutions are helping in Yemen, as an example of what they do in lots of other places.
That's great, yes. Well, in recent years, this coordination between the humanitarian and development actors in response to emerging and long-term humanitarian crises has been, I guess, developing and growing. So what can you tell us about the impact of this improved collaboration, and how do you see this helping the outcomes of the crises?
One of the things about humanitarian assistance is that while it's extremely effective in reducing people's suffering and saving lives, the UN, for example, last year we reached 100 million people in our humanitarian programs, and we unquestionably saved millions of lives. But humanitarian assistance on its own doesn't tend to contribute to solutions. A lot of the solutions to crises are in the space of peace building, conflict resolution, political negotiations, and especially development. And one of our big priorities in the United Nations under the tenure of Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General, who's my boss, is to join up the humanitarian activity with the development activity, so we make a bigger contribution to solving the underlying problems.
Absolutely, yes. And so this leads us to the issue of funding. Often when crises strike, there's just not enough funding available for an effective emergency response. So what are the real consequences of this underfunding, and how does OCHA and your partners deal with these limitations?
Well, let me just firstly say that in the recent period we have had record fundraising for our appeals. Last year, the United Nations, for the appeals we run, the needs we identify and the response plans it's my job to coordinate, we raised $15 billion, more than we've ever raised before. Not as much as we need, but more than we've raised before. Yeah. So my takeaway from that is that when people see a real need, which is expressed clearly, and when they can see that if they provide money it will be used effectively, the world remains compassionate and generous. But the overall needs are greater than the resources we're able to raise. So the answer to your question is that if our appeals don't get fully funded, lives are lost and suffering is increased. Now, we do have some ways of trying to address that a little bit. So one of the things it's my job to manage is this fund called the Central Emergency Response Fund, which has as part of its activity providing additional resources to the underfunded crises. Last year, we raised $550 million for the Central Emergency Response Fund, more than we've ever raised before. And what that means is, for those underfunded crises, we're able to invest more. So today, I am announcing the largest ever allocation we've made from our underfunded window in the Central Emergency Response Fund, an allocation of $125 million for 9 of the crises which are most underfunded in countries like Chad and Cameroon and Colombia, the occupied Palestinian territories, Haiti, a range of other places. And importantly, we are also having a very strong focus in that allocation on women and girls, because women and girls are the people who suffer most in crises, and also in another underfunded area, education. Many of the crises we're dealing with are long-lasting, and for a long-lasting crisis, what you run the risk of is a whole generation of kids who don't get an education, and I'm very keen to try to do a better job in that area. So what I would like, of course, is a much bigger fund. The United Nations member states have decided that the CERF, the Central Emergency Response Fund, should really be $1 billion. And if we can get to that point, and we're on an increasing trend, then that will mean that we'll have fewer crises which are underfunded.
That's fantastic. I'm thrilled that you were able to make that announcement with us today. Well done. Unfortunately, however, the world is in this period where we're seeing some of the worst humanitarian crises in decades, from Yemen to the Democratic Republic of Congo to Mozambique. How does UN OCHA prioritize these emergencies, and what roles do your partners play in preventing these crises from escalating?
So we have a systematic approach to identify humanitarian need and then to make proposals on how to respond to it. Every year, I publish something called the Global Humanitarian Overview. It's the world's most comprehensive, sophisticated, authoritative assessment of humanitarian need. And then alongside that, we develop response plans for every crisis. And we prioritize basically according to the number of people in need. So our biggest appeals are for places like Syria and Yemen, where, in the case of Yemen, there's up to 20 million people in need of assistance. In Syria, inside the country, about 13 million people in need of assistance. So our biggest appeals are for the biggest problems. But there are 35 or so countries where we need an appeal of some sort, and so we have a sort of fair process for identifying needs and responding to it. We're dealing all the time with new problems and new crises. Something else I'm announcing today is a new allocation to relieve the humanitarian suffering in Sudan. We're providing $27 million to relieve the suffering of people who are suffering through this huge economic crisis, which of course is one of the reasons why Sudanese people have been on the streets and asking for change. But as well as that political discussion going on, we think it's really important to meet people's basic needs when they're suffering so much. Absolutely.
Can I also ask what's being done right now to help the victims of Cyclone Idai in southern Africa?
A month ago, that terrible cyclone wreaked havoc. We have an appeal out for $394 million. I've got meetings here straight after you and I finish our conversation. There's a big meeting with all the donors in the countries to review how we're getting on. We have so far raised $102 million. I know there's going to be more announcements today.
Great.
Just to give you the case of Mozambique, where there is, the response is going quite well. We've provided 750,000 people with food in the last month. We've provided 750,000 people with health services and water services, and 100,000 people with shelter. So the response is moving forward. What we need to do, though, is also plan for recovery, because lots of agricultural land was put out of use in Malawi, Mozambique and Zimbabwe. Their harvest will be affected, so we need to think about not just the next weeks, but the next months and the next year or so.
Yes. And how about the DRC, given the Ebola outbreak and the other health crises, as well as ongoing violence and food insecurity?
Excuse me.
I know, I'm sorry, we're both
doing it, yeah. I was in the DRC a month or so ago. And there are 13 million people in that country who are suffering humanitarian crises. There's a new president as well, and I had a really encouraging conversation with President Tshisekedi, who said to me, as the first thing he talked about, how determined he is to try to do better for people who are displaced by crises. There's an opportunity to work with the new government to do that.
That's
now,
great.
on the Ebola problem, I also went up to the Ebola-affected areas, and I think all the agencies have been working as hard as they can to bring this outbreak under control. It's contained to a particular area of the country, but it's not under control yet, and there have been a spike of cases recently. The most important thing we need to do is work with local communities, to engage with local communities so that they are part of the response. What you have to do with Ebola is ask people to behave in different ways to what they're used to behaving. Hand washing, what happens when people are sick, to get them somewhere where they can be treated safely. And when people lose their lives, it's important that their bodies, which are very infectious, are dealt with in the right way. And that means different things to what people are used to in terms of when people pass on.
Right.
So if it's possible to bring this outbreak under control, we have to bring it under control, but it's going to take longer, and the most important thing is to work with local communities.
Great. So if I can ask you more of a personal question, as the UN Relief Chief, you are really confronted with the harshest realities of human suffering and violence on a daily basis. How do you cope and maintain your sense of hope and optimism? Do you see light at the end of the tunnel?
Right, so that's an important and good question. And as you said at the beginning, I have been doing this kind of work for a long time, 34 years actually. And I do travel the world and I see a lot of human suffering. And you never get used to that. It always has a big effect on you emotionally. The thing I hold on to is that, as well as suffering, I've seen progress and improvement. Lots of countries I've worked in are now doing much better. So what I do is remind myself that things can get better. And we need to work as hard as we can to relieve people's suffering and try and give them better hope for the future.
Well, thank you so much, Mark. It's been an honor to speak with you, and we thank you for your dedication to the world's most vulnerable communities.
Thank you.
And thank you also to our online audience for joining us. I hope you can join us for more of these Global Voices conversations and also watch more events on World Bank Live. Don't forget to add your voice to the conversation using the hashtag WBGmeetings. I'm Lana Wong from the World Bank Group, and I hope to see you online soon.